My name's Robert Torday. I'm Head of Marketing at JMP. Welcome to the studio. We're delighted to be hosting this Article 25 evening and to welcome Sunand Prasad, Trustee of Article 25, who will be chairing the panel discussion at the end of the session, together with B. Senevald, Director of Projects. Make Design Matter is a series of monthly talks that Article 25 organise on humanitarian architecture and social impact. The aim of these talks is to provide a platform for dialogue between professionals in the built environment and showcasing humanitarian architecture. John McAslan Partners is known for its extensive initiative portfolio. Some 5% of our work over the last 20 years has been devoted to that particular activity and contributing innovative design to assist communities all over the world facing environmental and social challenges. Diverse projects ranging from the restoration of the iron market in Haiti following the devastating earthquake in 2010 to an auditorium at the Memorial Centre in Kigali in Rwanda, a centre providing education and reconciliation, completed to mark the 20th anniversary of the 1994 genocide. This evening's presentations are given by two of the practice's associates, Heather Macy in the green shirt and Georgina Ward, who is there. Heather will talk about our recently launched Hidden Homeless Initiative, a competition which explored radical and innovative housing proposals for homeless young people across the capital. But the first talk will be by Georgina, and she will be focusing on the practice's Malawi schools. A project that was set up in partnership with the Clinton Global Initiative and the Malawi Ministry of Education, seeking to provide free primary education for all children in low-cost, environmentally responsive classroom buildings. Just a bit of housekeeping information, briefly. Should there be a fire, the door's back there. If you need the loos, they're just through the doorway between here and reception. Arrayed along the benches here are brochures that cover various aspects of our work, and you're more than welcome to read them and indeed take them away. So thank you, and I'm now going to pass over to Georgina.
So, hi everyone, thank you so much for coming today. It's really great to see all of you here and come and listen to our talk. So today the first project I want to talk to you about is our Rural Schools Building Programme in Malawi. This is actually not the most recent project. The final built project completed actually about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But we think it's a really kind of good time to look back at some of these projects, particularly this one, as it was a prototype project that was hopefully going to lead on to kind of changes within the school design in Malawi. And we want to kind of look back at it and think of the success rate and really see if there are any lessons learned from understanding the history of this project. So first I wanted to think about kind of look at some key statistics. And firstly, if we think about an 18-year-old in Malawi today leaving school, of those, 77% completed primary school, 19% attended secondary school but failed to complete their secondary education, 7% completed secondary education, and 1% will study beyond secondary level. 5% received no education at all. And these are kind of some really vital statistics of understanding the situation of education in Malawi, both at the time that we were working, and whilst it has improved since then, there hasn't been the level of improvement that we were hoping for at the time. And as part of that, when we first started on the project, there was a key vision statement set out by the Malawian Ministry of Education as part of Vision 2020. And this had the aim of increasing primary enrolment to 95% and secondary enrolment to 30%. This was particularly in regards to looking at rural education, because 82% of Malawi people live in rural areas rather than the urban areas, and those are particular areas where there's difficulties with kind of getting people to school, both the distance of school, accessibility to school, and the quality of the school buildings themselves, and huge amounts of dropout as you kind of get up through the education. So as Robert was saying, we first started engaging in this project with the Hunter Clinton Foundation through a connection with John and Hunter himself. And that led to us kind of first going to Malawi back in 2008, I think, on a series of studies trying to understand the contextual situation of education and school design in Malawi as it was. This led to 3 different school projects itself, but I think really importantly, we kind of were trying to establish what this brief might be, and a huge amount of that brief was understanding what the current situation was, and we did a huge process of review of a few different schools out in Malawi. As part of that, we tried to establish a brief for these schools with the Clinton Foundation. The first one was to match or reduce cost for the existing school building model, and this really meant in reality that we needed to try and develop a school model which would provide a 2-classroom school block for $25,000. And that was the benchmark that we must try and improve the environmental, the planning design, the kind of usability design, but all within that £25,000 rate. Alongside that, of course, in any project when you're kind of looking to be building abroad, you need to be understanding the local market, using local skills and labour and local materials where possible to ensure that we're not just building something which is a one-off and that can be continued as this prototype design as we move forward. We wanted to improve on the existing school's performance in daylighting and thermal comfort. We did a lot of research in terms of trying to understand the current thermal comfort and daylight situation in the school and see all these different options, trying to improve it in terms of materiality and construction of the school. Importantly, is local community ownership of the school. So we didn't want to leave and it not be it's a local school, it's for local people, and they are completely part of both the design of the school in terms of consultation to get to the designs we ended up with, and just ensuring that the school prospers. And I think local ownership of the school was also really important in terms of ensuring that students went to the school. So much of the drop-off in terms of numbers of students going to the schools in Malawi were to do with kind of access to the school, safety often at the school, and by having community ownership of the spaces, you ensured that kind of parents were there, the younger children were there, and everyone felt it was a space they wanted to go to. So it actually increased the attainment at the school at the time. So, and then we're also intent on providing simple buildable instructions. So the schools we were designing were as simple as possible, but still to achieve those aims, to ensure that they could be a prototype which can be duplicated in other sites. Then finally, quite a tricky thing in a country which has actually quite a few different climate types within a relatively small area of land. It was trying to develop a singular design which adapts to varying climatic geography and cultural conditions. So as I was saying, we started with a whole series of research into the existing school models, looking at different types of construction, from traditional adobe and thatched roof to burnt brick, to cement block, and then to soil stabilised bricks. With each one, and this was done primarily in collaboration with ARUP, Adrian Campbell from the ARUP office, who the team went out all together and went and studied all of these various schools, looked at it in terms of internal comfort, cost, environmental impact, etc., and tried to find key areas within the local vernacular of architecture and the local knowledge and material usage that would be most suitable for a new school. We also looked at daylighting within all of the existing school buildings, and typically the average daylight factor was 1.5%. The target daylight factor would be 4 to 5%. So we were seeing a minimum design consideration of 2% and trying to really get up to 3% if we could. We also looked at the whole school holistically in terms of cost, in terms of all these different models, and tried to understand where all the different costs were coming from. These were specifically with the previous Clinton Foundation models for school design. And so much of the cost was coming in the foundations and the slab. We're trying to see where were the key areas that we could try and target cost savings to actually make improvements to the overall fabric of the school itself. And then this is kind of a diagram which analyses those key things, pinpointing some key areas, both as well in the plan of the school, in terms of most of the schools we looked at, had kind of a porch which ran down one side of the classrooms, and this was actually not very good utilisation of space, and we could find better usage for it. There was very poor, a lot of solar radiation through the tin roof, no consideration of high-level ventilation, so there was very little ventilation in and out of the building, and very poor cross-ventilation at the same time, and also poor quality daylight. So this led us to start developing a new plan model for the school in the first instance. Firstly, we were, as we said, keen to design out the porch and think about how we could create many usable spaces, but with only 2 core classrooms. Because what was really central to the community brief for the schools was that they wanted something really flexible that could be used in many different ways at different times of the day, not just education for the primary school children, but also for anything from kind of adult learning in the evenings to health groups or a health centre. And so what we were trying to do was create these different uses of spaces by creating a separating model. So we ended up splitting the 2 classrooms and creating a space in the middle, and then a classroom at either end, kind of a covered space at either end of the space also. And then over that we have kind of one singular roof which covers the whole space. And you see this kind of in diagram form where you have a central space where people can mill and use as a second teaching area, 2 core classrooms, and then also covered spaces at either end. And that in a more detailed plan form, you can see it above. So it's a very simple plan, but a classroom 1 and classroom 2, an external classroom middle, and 2 terraces. At the time, we were also looking at, because a huge amount of the issues we're trying to improve the education offer in Malawi in terms of numbers of schools was actually numbers of teachers. So we're looking at providing teaching accommodation adjacent to each of the schools. This is, I think, in maybe one of the schools this was provided, but it wasn't in the other 2. So in terms of moving on from the plan form of the building, we're also looking at the building in math and in section to ensure that we're considering the environmental aspects of the school. And one of the key features was thinking about the roof of the school and how we can try and get a really good amount of cross-ventilation and daylight through a really simple move of the roof in terms of creating like an overlap roofing design. So this is a section of the proposed roof of the schools that were built. You can see that by creating an overlap to the roof, you have a clear space for high-level ventilation. We also use kind of the lower level roof to try and get water for irrigation as water storage, and then also potential for energy generation through solar panels. Alongside that, there was better cross-ventilation within the space through the use of louvers in the glazed areas. And this is kind of quite different to the existing school model in terms of how both the insulation provided with little insulation in the existing one and quite a bit in the preferred also. And this, you can see that we've actually got a model there, so if you want to go and take a look at it after, it shows kind of the structure of the roof and how that works in terms of the ventilation coming through and the overall form of the different classroom spaces. So prior to commencing construction of any of these schools, we also did a lot of studies with ARAP on the supposed improvement in daylighting and thermal performance. By the simple move of that roof structure and also a slight increase in the amount of glazing externally, we managed to improve the daylight factor to 3.4% from 1.5%. That was tested in the built schools and it was correct to the studies done, and it's a massive improvement on the daylight levels in all of the schools. We also, as part of this project, it wasn't just, as I was saying before, it wasn't just about building the individual schools, but it was about developing a design manual and something which could then be used by all sorts of different education establishments moving forward. And so as part of it, we tried to create a set of kind of really usable, simple instructions about the orientation of the building, the position of the building, the use of landscapes, the use of topography and so on within the space. And alongside that, there was a large set of detailed construction drawings. This is just one of them, which we tried to very simply set out the different methods for the construction of the school. And then here we've got a few construction drawings. We saw that one of the key points as well was, as we were saying, was trying to ensure that there's real use of local labour and local materials. So we looked at all the different types of wall construction types, and we decided that the soil stabilised bricks was actually both the most environmentally efficient, and also it meant that it would provide skilled labour training to for people within the local area. And all of the bricks in most of the schools were built on site as part of that process. And then this is one of the 3 schools completed. I think whilst there are 3 school sites, I think there are about 6 buildings completed in total, so it's a total of 12 new classrooms. And you can see here that's kind of the central space used as another teaching area alongside the other spaces as well. And then in terms of the end teaching space, it's just a small, more informal space that people would start to gather at and actually use you could see the smaller children watching their kind of older brother and sister learn inside. In terms of internally, the daylighting levels were really, really good within the space. The ventilation was a lot better than other teaching space we looked at. We also, importantly, particularly Arup went back and did a whole series of post-occupancy studies, both in terms of interviews with the users and teachers and students and parents, but then also actual thermal studies and daylight studies to test that. So this is a view through to the central space as well, with just the teaching spaces just used independently. And then here you can actually see those external spaces used a lot more with, as I was saying, kind of the younger children actually often watching their older siblings learn, and then other teaching activities happening outside. So you get a really transformative teaching space. And finally as well, you also see so many of the parents using the teaching spaces as well. So they're there during the day, so it becomes more occupied by the community and kind of owned by the community, which was just a really important part of the project, that it's very much a community school. And finally, as I was saying, we did a whole series of post-occupancy studies because it was really important for us that we didn't stop the project there, and that we wanted to understand what was successful, what wasn't so successful, and what we could put that learning back into to ensure that any of the working from the next prototype schools could learn from this. So there were key issues which were found. So say, for example, the size of the classroom doors. We found that the hinges, you couldn't get the hinge sizes that we needed in Malawi, and they were sent from elsewhere. So therefore, in the next iteration of the designs, we reduced the classroom door sizes so that the hinges could be got locally. There are small things like all the teachers said, why don't we have a ledge for the chalk? So the next iteration of design had a chalk ledge, and same with storage and security. And then there are also bits of the design that ended up being added, but weren't actually necessary. So quite a few of the projects, the local team put a floor screed in, but it wasn't required and that ended up cracking. And then there's also issues with the shutters, so the size of those were adjusted externally. And so finally, this just shows all of the different schools that were completed. And since we completed the last school, which is Site C in Chimbalu School, there's been the first thing we did was we put the whole design on an open architecture site so that it could be shared. We also worked with the Malawi Institute of Education and shared the design with them. So they've picked up certain details within the design of their kind of model schools going forward. They've more picked up the foundation details, so the use of brick strip foundations rather than concrete foundations. And also the plan layouts have actually been used in quite a few schools, but so far I don't think they have picked up the roof form of the school. And there's also the designs were sent to other charities such as Save the Children to look at other schools that could be built within there. And finally, this is just a final graph looking at the completion rate of primary school children by year in Malawi. It shows, I think, when we completed our projects about kind of 2010, 2012, and it was at about a 65% rate of completion. It's now at, 2014, the latest statistics we could find, it was at 76 to 78, so it certainly is on an upwards trajectory. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So hi, I'm Heather Macy, another associate at John McAslan Partners, and I'm here today to talk to you about our Hidden Homeless Initiative. So bear with me, there's quite a few statistics in here. Oh yeah, okay. So homelessness today. So just to give you guys an overview of where we are. I think everybody knows homelessness is getting worse and worse, and today we have 9,000 people sleeping rough on the streets every year. So, you know, that has dramatically increased since 2010 by about 3 times. We're now at a point where on any one night we could have up to 1,200 people sleeping rough on the street. So just to talk a little bit about the effects of homelessness, we've talked about the increase of it over the last 5 years. The national statistics found 600 people dead in England and Wales in 2017, and the average age of death is significantly lower, so men 44, women 42, and you can see the averages there. You're 17 times more likely to be a victim of violent crime and 9 times more likely to commit suicide, so it's pretty harrowing statistics. A statistic lots of people don't talk about is hidden homeless. So of those statistics, a lot they're based on the figures you can count, the people that you can see on the street, but there's a whole load of people which GLA refer to as hidden homeless, which are not counted, and that accounts to, we think, 400,000 people in the UK every year. So that's people sleeping on sofas, in hostels, overcrowded conditions, bed and breakfasts, all those type of things. And contrary to public opinion, it's for a host of reasons, and 40% is actually loss of assured short-term tenancy, despite the fact a third of the population thinking homelessness is the fault of the homeless people, so it's a real shame. This is just an overview of statistics of the kind of worst boroughs in London, so you can see it's a range, but it's pretty shocking on all accounts. Next. And just, well, not a fun slide, but a kind of overview of history. I guess none of it's that fun, but it's changed a lot. I mean, the 1800s, all of policy was based around, how do we get homeless people kind of out of sight. Had the Vacancy Act, which, this is the terminology from that time: no begging, loitering, wandering abroad, which means basically being homeless, misbehaving in the workhouse, telling fortunes, prostitution, or abandoning of one's family. 20th century changed a lot. Legislation changed to actually put onus on the government to deal with the issue rather than hide the issue. And this image here shows one of the workhouses where people were allowed to rest and stay warm for a night, but not sleep. So if they were slept, they were kicked out. So obviously a long way to go there. And then just coming to the 70s and 80s, where there's a massive surgence of kind of bed and breakfasts and hostels, which is obviously unsustainable and not a fit place for people to be. So that kind of sets a bit of a background context. So housing crisis. We all know that homelessness is a result of, in part, the housing crisis. We know that there's a housing shortage that by 2020 is estimated to be by 1 million down. 74% increase since 2010, so 83,000 households are in unstable temporary accommodation, and I'll talk a bit more about temporary accommodation in a minute. Massive funding gap for that temporary accommodation, probably not a sustainable way to be going forward anyway. And obviously there's this ongoing pledge to end homelessness, which the current date is 2027. So, just again, retouching on why people become homeless, and, I think there's a big problem in kind of education around this issue. But, as I mentioned previously, end of private rented tenancy, 15,700 people that have run out of options with family and friends, similar number. Domestic abuse and relationship breakdown, which is one of the biggest issues, and eviction for supported housing. They're just the top ones, but I mean, obviously there's another host of issues. Next. So yeah, of looking at the kind of breakdown of that, I think everybody knows about the lack of accommodation for families. That's well reported in the news. Young single people aged 16 to 24 is just as big a problem, and there is much less facilities available for these people. So this, again, just gives you some statistics. So 12,830 young single people, 15,300 single parent with dependent. Families, 8,720, and then of single, you can see obviously there's a much higher proportion of single males to females. So if you imagine trying to house all of those people together, that's quite a difficult thing to do because there's very different aspirations and needs for each of those groups. So that's a big part of the problem as well. So addressing homelessness. You know, everybody wants to help, everybody should want to help, and I think they do. Everybody should have a home. So, you know, people are helping and people are doing brilliant things. You know, there's some just a couple of examples here of, you know, permanent example, brilliant scheme, 40 square metre houses which have training, counselling and amenities alongside it. This is a scheme in San Francisco which is just looking more aware. I think a lot of people are moving towards kind of prefabrication, looking at intermediate housing solutions. And then this is a kind of quite old scheme by Bird scheme, but brilliant scheme looking at using, you know, the assets that we have. So single occupancy accommodation within garages. So just coming back full loop, I mean, I think this graph is really, really helpful in just showing how much of an issue we have with temporary accommodation, not just with need, but with the fact that, you know, that's where a lot of people are situated, kind of in the process. And sofa surfing is the beginning of that journey. So again, just coming back to that hidden homeless statistic, it's a very poignant moment because obviously it's the beginning of something which could go very much one of two ways, and the point at which we really should be starting to look at and addressing the homeless crisis. So next. So New Horizon Youth Centre is a charity that we've worked with for a very long time. They're based in Camden. They address this issue head on. They deal with 16 to 25-year-olds. They don't just provide homeless accommodation, they provide a whole service. And as I said, they deal with young homeless people. So next. So this is just a kind of overview of their business model, which is quite rare because quite often you'll have one service that provides shelter, another that maybe is therapy, one that's food. You know, all of these things are quite disparate, spread across London, not necessarily accessible to the individual's friends or location that they're obviously comfortable being in, and it's just a very difficult way to operate. So, as I said, they deal with young single homeless people. They provide emergency accommodation, so just coming back to the needs gap. One of the biggest deficits is this emergency accommodation, which is 28 days, people at the very beginning of that journey, and just kind of addressing that need then. They offer therapy, life skills, employment, education, health, wellbeing, and, you know, food and beverages, so it's all in-house. And actually, they help people throughout the process to even getting a job, so they're affiliated with local businesses, like local kind of pubs and restaurants and things, and can see that process through, so when if anything's going wrong, that they're still there to support them. And it's a viable business, so they can support themselves because, next slide, they have an amazing event space which they can rent out, and actually that kind of supports the business in the background. So this here is their headquarters. This building that you can see here with the internal space is their event space, and this is an extension that came off the back of the first initiative that we did with them. So off the back of John doing a presentation about the housing crisis, he met John Snow, who is affiliated with this charity, the broadcaster, and New Horizon Youth Centre, and was discussing how can we help you, you know, get more money to support your business and just offer a better service. So we did a review of their premises and suggested that we would run an architectural design competition to create this event space and better facilities for them overall. And this is the product of that competition 10 years ago. So that was our beginning of our journey with them. And that is the beginning of the context of the hidden homeless competition. So I met with New Horizon Youth Centre a couple of years ago to just talk about the need today and how that's changing and what's the next step in their journey. And obviously, as every charity is struggling right now, they do not have enough accommodation to keep people off the street. They're turning people away every morning. And that was something that we were tasked to kind of help them with. So we thought, you know, it's worked once before, let's try the same model again. So initially, the idea was an architectural competition to design shelter to get something built for New Horizon Youth Centre as quickly as possible. What was supposed to be this very quick 6-month initiative turned into kind of 2 years of numerous discussions and became something much bigger than that, because actually, you know, there's 100 initiatives around from well-meaning people that make these things happen, but there's an issue of policy here, and actually, the more you dig into it, the more you need to look at it from, you know, kind of systemic level. So we set the brief to provide shelter, provide a means of income to support that shelter, provide security and privacy and safety. There's a lot of issues around not just the security of the people in the shelter, but obviously the neighbours around and perceptions about what having a homeless shelter near other uses would do. And then funding. So funding to support the build of the space itself. So as I said, the thing grew legs, so we started talking to a lot of people. There's a letter of endorsement there from the Deputy Mayor, who's one of the first people that we started speaking to, James Murray. He's very supportive of the scheme, and we spent a lot of time working with kind of planning consultants, developers, various people, just going around talking to boroughs, just to say how do we make this process more straightforward so that this isn't one project, this could be multiple projects. And you know, the London plan, the new London plan, does have a provision in it for emergency accommodation, but it really isn't black and white. You really have to look for it, and you really kind of need to want to do it. So, you know, we were working quite hard with James Murray and others to just say, well, how can we open this up? And this was the beginning of the process, so there's a couple of the discussions there. So in that, naively at the beginning, I had in my mind that we would have 3 sites, they'd be ready to go, and the first, second and third winner would build the project immediately. Obviously that didn't happen. But what we did manage to do was get TfL to loan us York Road Railway Station, which was, in our minds, perfect for this competition because, you know, homeless people sleep a lot outside stations, they feel safe there, there's warmth. So kind of idealistically, you know, and it's a disused building that has been, you know, disused for 16 years. So these are the types of projects or buildings that we should be looking at. And very kindly TfL loaned me the site for the purpose of the competition. I was, again, hoping that we'd kind of push it through. It hasn't quite happened with that site, but I'll talk more about how it's going forward shortly. So, anyway, so the competition was finally launched. We have 47 submissions, which is incredible, from really, really high calibre, all of them, architects, and really, really thoughtful. We asked them all to come up with, essentially, proposals for homeless accommodation on that site, a private component which would pay for the build of that homeless accommodation. So, you know, in much the way that we do affordable housing these days, potentially something like that could work. Not necessarily residential. There would have to be some component on the site that whoever's running the centre could live on that site and be there 24/7, and that plays directly into the needs of the people on that site, but also the fact that, just coming back to the point about neighbours, actually having something managed 24/7 in terms of a kind of value model for a developer should help to kind of de-risk any anxieties about values going forward. We asked all of them to put forward a business case that would explain how the thing could support itself going forward, and all of them to think about, you know, ways that it's an idealistic proposition, but ways that, you know, those two uses could knit together and work together and really create a kind of holistic proposal for the site. So yeah, these are the 47 submissions. The winner was Morrison Company, and we had RCKA second, Katia de House third, and Adam Khan Architects. The board of people judging the competition was really, really diverse, and I think it was really powerful for that. So we had, you know, as I mentioned, Deputy Mayor John Snow, DP9, Pocket Living, and we had Poppy Noir, who is used to be homeless and is now a journalist with The Guardian, and it's like a really good range of opinions. And actually, I think the outcome of the selections very much show that. So, for example, Katia de House was third, and actually her business model to have a hotel alongside homeless in a kind of business capacity in terms of steps of coming out of homelessness. So not just, you know, having shelter and leaving, but actually being able to work through various stages of employment was incredibly clever, and the way that it was detailed was really smart. And, you know, RCKA had done a really extensive review of the different types of homeless people and how they would all exist together. And Morrison Company had a stepping stone approach, which is essentially why they won, for multiple types of living on that site that took people all the way through. And alongside that, co-working facilities that had shared amenity spaces that would allow those user groups to come together in a way that was safe and not inflicting unnecessary harm on kind of people's levels of privacy on both sides, but also as a working model going forward, there was suggestion of kind of reduced rents for people going into these office spaces in the instance that they would offer people work, a certain number of kind of the homeless people work going forward. So, you know, the business models that sit behind these wonderful designs are actually just as, if not more important to the whole process. So yeah, the winning scheme. So we've talked about Morrison Company. So, you know, their whole strategy for the ground floor was a very opening ground floor plane. You know, drawing people in and creating that community environment. You can see here, again, they've mapped the demographic and the spaces and the kind of wider reach of people outside in terms of sustaining the development. They also had a charity shop and various other things, but also externally for people within that development and how they could grow and adapt within the wider kind of King's Cross area. Yeah, and again, you can see the stepping stone approach shows short stay, mid stay to co-live, and that kind of very gentle but ordered progression through those spaces. Next, yeah, nice visual. Next, and this was the night of the launch, so we were kind of overwhelmed. We had, I think, 120 people at the event. It was amazing, and just the amount of people that came up to us at the end, and there's a real ambition and drive just in the world generally for people to help with these type of things. It was much more than we expected, and it was great. So yeah, that's just some photos. Plenty of press on it. I think it's just worth saying that it doesn't end at the competition, and actually everybody involved in it, the entrants, the judges, the people that fed into the brief are still working on this initiative, and we are still working to get it built. So there's a number of developers that are coming forward with sites, and we're determined that Morrison Company do build something, and we individually are also looking at ways of pushing it forward in our capacity as well. So next. What next? So next. 9,000 people sleeping rough every year. If they had, this is just a high-level study, if they had 25 square metres each, how much accommodation is that? 25,000 square metres of accommodation. How hard can it be, right? So next slide. Really crudely put, you've got 7 buildings, 20 stories tall, split between, say, 2 boroughs. Why is it so difficult? Next. So this is our kind of next step. So I've set up an architects working group. So I'm working with the various policymakers and people that we've met through the competition, and our ambition is that something will get built, not just one thing. Each of us have an ambition to build something. Collectively, we have an ambition to change policy and challenge ideas around how it's done today. And I think the most meaningful thing for me out of the competition is this collective endeavour to change the way things are being done. So next. Very pixelated photo, but there is hope. I just didn't want to depress everyone with too many statistics about homelessness, but it's an amazing thing to engage in, and everybody should, because you really can make a difference. Thanks.
So I'm going to ask 1 or 2 questions, but before we start, Bee, can I introduce Bee Senevald? She's already been introduced briefly. She's the Director of Projects at Article 25. And for those, I'm sure you all know what Article 25 is, so I won't waste time describing that. But Bee was set up the offices of DSR, so she's had a whole architectural career, a very distinguished one, with healthcare and laboratory design, and now she's doing amazing work with Article 25, including projects rather like that ones we've just seen. But Bee, any reflections to start with on either of or both of these wonderful presentations?
Yes, they were really terrific, and they show the will to engage, to look at the world beyond the models and the developments that we do in central London that are driven by commerce and money and investments, and are for people who have these resources, who have money, and who can live a comfortable life here. And both of these projects treat the other end of the spectrum, people who, as we have seen, perhaps don't even have a primary school education, and people in London who have fallen out of this comfortable way of life, maybe through no fault of their own, or just find themselves without having a place to live, and are trying to cope in a really rough environment, because what we normally build and what comes out of our projects is not suitable for them. They haven't got the resources to use it or to move in. So I found both of these, terrifically inspiring, and they're very much similar to the values that we pursue at Article 25. And I have a lot of questions too, but I'll let Sunan go first.
Okay, so yeah, having said all the nice things, some challenging things. And actually, Article 25 hasn't done so much work in this society in the UK. So our work is much more like the Malawi schools. But I mean, both actually assume a role for buildings, firstly. Now, I'm an architect, so I have no doubt about the role for buildings. But one of the challenges that is thrown back is, so for example, take the Malawi school. I've heard people say when they've seen Article 25 projects and the blackboard outside, and there is a certain kind of commonality to all these projects. They say, but look, I mean, why should the children in Malawi not have the IT, not have all the things that we have here? Why are we so content to just make that tiny difference? And why isn't this just a way of avoiding investing the real money? And in a way, there's a parallel question with homelessness, which is actually there shouldn't be homelessness, and actually there's something fixed and broken in society that causes that to happen, and those are very deep structural problems. If we just build buildings to house, in some kind of almost filing cabinet way, the homeless, then we are avoiding the real issues. So these are, in a way, I'm asking you to help us answer those questions. I'm not really, I have my own thoughts about it, but how would you respond?
Can I? Well, I guess my initial response would be that we're not content with it just being a school like that. That's what I mean. This is a step that we can take as architects, and with kind of trying to push forward with the funding streams that are there. But personally, I'm not content with it just being like that, and I think everyone should have the same level of education, both when you think about in the UK, just kind of the disparity between private schools and state schools, but then taking it out into somewhere like Malawi, where the disparity changes even more. And I think you're completely right. There's a social conscience in an architect that needs to push that as much as possible. We try to, I think, and I think particularly with Heather's project as well, there's so much that as an architect you can do by pushing that agenda with the contacts to the clients we have and the people we work with. I think there's actually real opportunity to push that agenda in everything we do.
Great. Heather, you want to say?
Hi. I think it's a really interesting question. I think
that's not on actually.
Oh,
no, it is.
Try this one.
Yeah.
Okay. I think with homelessness in particular, I mean, the last two slides I put up there to be a bit dramatic and facetious, potentially a little bit, but it's just, you're right, buildings do not solve homelessness. There's a bigger issue there. But a lot of it boils down from the housing crisis generally, and there is a lack of buildings for people to live in the capital. So yes, building shoebox style homeless accommodation is definitely not the solution. There's a much bigger aspiration, and I think the competition, looking at the outcomes, the idea behind that was that it was much more of a holistic vision, and I think, there's a reason that it wasn't the idea of building one project in one location and actually questioning policy and speaking to all these various people, is because that competition was as much about raising awareness as it was about a final outcome. And I think in the process, we've spoken to a number of people, and a number of projects have come out of it, and a number of developers working on projects that weren't going to do specific things are now starting to think about doing different things. And whether that be a small step in the beginning, it's changing perceptions and changing people's understanding about what homelessness is and how we should be helping, whether that's policy level or another level, but also starting to respond to try and change it, because there is a situation now, and albeit responding to that situation isn't dealing with a systemic issue, but it's still there. So you need to kind of do both in parallel.
But I think projects like this also highlight, particularly the Heather's project we're talking about in Hidden Homeless, the changes that change in policy can do and the influence that we could have as architects could have over that, and also highlighting kind of I think is it Finland that now has a housing first model rather than people going into homeless shelters, and it's a completely different reversal. So rather than that stepping, you end up with you give everyone a home, and that should be something that we should eventually aim for, but it's just that stepping stone policy change to get to it.
Great. Everybody, please prepare your questions. We hope we have as many questions as there are audience members, and we'll have to cut it short, but B.
And I want to address what you may think is a secondary point, but it actually isn't. You know, as bereft as a homeless person is, maybe having just a piece of cardboard to sleep on, they have needs and desires just like everybody else. And I have seen a project in Los Angeles that was built for the homeless that the homeless refused to use because it wasn't communal enough. And sleeping in the street, they had sort of set up their communities on different city blocks, and they wanted to be with their friends. They didn't want to be in a place that had perhaps the right accommodation, but it didn't have this communal atmosphere. So I think the input and the brief development and asking people what is actually needed, whether it's a school in Malawi or a homeless shelter, what actually provides the right social environment, it shouldn't be sidestepped. It needs to be part of it. And we shouldn't assume that we know what it is. What I found really interesting about your competition was that rather than designing architecturally, you were really challenging people to come up with a business model, something that was economically sustainable and that did a lot more than provide accommodation, that also provided all those stepping stones for people to get the right clothing, to find a job, to get back on their own 2 feet. And these things are not that simple. It's not just you provide a bed and they're fine, they can go on a job interview. It doesn't work like that. So there is so many social supports and economic supports that have to come with it. So it's really the architect as a social inventor and as a sort of a remaker of a part of society. And that is a really interesting task and a really interesting thing for our profession to perhaps get into it more and see how that might work. We spent a lot of time doing, quote, mixed use development. And this is true mixed use, actually to benefit a set of people that really need it.
I think, yeah, and I think it's looking at it from two sides. So, you know, obviously we're automatically focusing on the needs of the homeless population, but for it to be sustainable, you need to look at the needs of the person that sits alongside them. And I think it's important someone does sit alongside them and they're not segregated. I mean, that was part of the premise of it. But for example, that's why the hotel model was so interesting. And, you know, there were plenty of examples of clever things like co-living and student accommodation and, you know, various complementary uses that you really thought about how those inhabitants could live together and actually help each other, not just one way, and re-educate people. Because, you know, today people care a lot more about where their money goes, I think, and they want to know it's going to a good cause, and actually it shouldn't be a negative thing. And if it was packaged in the right way and everybody's kind of bought into it, it should be good for both sides of that equation. So it's kind of trying to move it.
Has it been hard to interest investors or
I've had
people who have
to
put the money in the first place?
Yeah, it's been long debates with different developers have different opinions, and you know, I have a long list of the thing I'm looking at currently is meanwhile uses and empty sites in London, and I have a list of developers who told me, well, we wouldn't do it in a permanent capacity, but we would be very interested if you could make it work in a meanwhile capacity. So I'm at the beginning of that, but I think it's really interesting that if you could get a list of sites with a time allocation and, you know, evidence that you could kind of move these proposals around, and they're not just shoeboxes, they're a whole community of various uses. Clients are much more comfortable with that because it always comes down to two things. So if it's permanent, it's the value conundrum for the development. If it's meanwhile, it's, you know, they're automatically thinking about the front page article of, I don't want to be the developer kicking that person off my site if you don't have another stop for them to go to. So it's always kind of what's the structure that sits behind it and giving them comfort. It's not the unwillingness to do it, it's that kind of bigger political situation. So
great, thank you. No, that's good, that's good. So we have a hand up in the audience. Please, can I give you? Am I going to do the right thing? I have done.
So, well, thank you very much for a good presentation and very valuable work that you're doing. I fully appreciate the fact that we are suffering from a disease of homelessness, in my opinion. Last year, I was living in Brighton, and I promise you that almost every other doorstep had a homeless. And on the seafront, on the benches at night, I call them the premier hotels. They were all full, the benches. Now, I traveled along the south coast towns, Shoreham and places like that. In the evening, the shops are closed and the upper floors are empty. There are so much accommodations that are not used. And we do have quite a considerable amount of stock to house people. But for various reasons, we are failing to do so. Now, on the other hand, I came across a project that was a local authority project which investing in the regions of 1.5 to 1.7 million to convert an existing unused pub into a 10 social housing for homeless people. And this was just to be for 5 years. After 5 years, that building would be demolished and new development would take place of it. So that is appalling. You know, I think as architects, we are to do something in waking people up and raising people's awareness of the fact that what is happening to the money, where is it going? And
Thanks. I'd like to move on.
Just want to finish my talk with a question that how permanent are these projects? I mean, the project that you introduced for housing, how permanent is it?
Great. Thank you. I'm going to take a few questions if we can in a cluster, and then we can have a discussion. Over there, can we pass the microphone?
I'll speak loudly. Hi, thanks for the presentations. I was just going to ask about the capacity building opportunity that comes from the project. So every construction project is an opportunity to build skills for the people that are involved locally. So I just want to more the experience.
Thank you very much. Let's have one more. Go on, somebody have a go. All right, we've got plenty of chewy things to talk about though, which is empty spaces. And actually this reminds me of the early 80s when local authorities bought up a lot of homes for municipalization. They were left empty. I was involved in squatting and opening up buildings for, including for homeless people. And I think that is an interesting thing about the fact that we do have capacity already without building anymore, probably. I think somebody said we've got more bedrooms in this country than we have people. So where is the housing shortage? This is a silly question, I know, but it's nevertheless worth thinking about. The second thing is about the temporary and permanent issue. I think there's two sides to that, and I was going to ask about the capacity as well, because actually at Article 25, and B knows this more than anybody else, you know, to some extent, the building is almost an incidental kind of collateral advantage of what you're really trying to do, which is to build capacity and resilience. So who would like to go first?
Well, in terms of the capacity and resilience, firstly, I think there's a few different sides to that. There's firstly just the education and employment opportunities of a construction site. What was really important, particularly to the Malawi projects, was ensuring that as much as possible of the work could be done by local employment and local teams, often on site. So, for example, not only the construction of kind of the building, but also the construction of the materials. So the stabilised soil bricks were generally formed on site, and so that gave employment to people on the site, but also upskilled people for areas that they hadn't necessarily used before. I think in terms of capacity building as a wider concept, I think it's about how these schools become not only schools but community centres and bring communities together in a different way. It's very similar to how a new school, and we hope will kind of create a community aspect within the UK as well, just to create a bringing of people together and a shared knowledge, I think, and giving that ability, particularly in a rural community where there aren't those local places for people to go to, is just really, really important. And so much of the work we were doing within the rural communities that didn't have somewhere for that kind of activity.
Have you noticed any lasting legacy already from these schools and the local capacity that you built?
I'm not sure. I know that most of the post-occupancy evaluation that we did was in the couple of years after. I went back and I saw one of these schools maybe 3-4 years ago, and it was still kind of a local vibrant centre, but I don't know the exact capacity for kind of the
Is anyone doing
now.
Analysis of the legacy impacts of
we
that whole
have
programme?
been doing the analysis, but it's something that we need to go back to. And
No, we have the same
it's
problem.
something
We've only just started doing it, so it's good to know. About the empty homes and the temporariness.
Empty buildings, it's a big topic. I think Generation Rent did a very interesting proposal about what if the Houses of Parliament were to evacuate and go and stay somewhere else, and the whole building was to be full of social housing. And it's a big topic because you do walk around the city and you do see empty buildings, and you also see increasing numbers of homelessness, and it's not fair. But it comes back to policy, and it comes back to, I think there's a willingness to address homelessness and use these buildings, but I don't think the policy's there to make it safe and easy for people to do so. I said previously the kind of London plan doesn't have any obvious route to follow. There's an obvious route to follow, for example, for affordable housing. Developers know that, they know it's safe, they can follow that, and they're going to have a potentially easy enough process in doing that. This is different. It's not done as much, and it's therefore not as safe, and people don't like risk. So I think policy needs to change to make it happen more, because it is happening. Like you and I did a scheme with St Mungo's Inn as part of their affordable housing provision. They have some space for vulnerable women. It is happening, but it's happening when people have the will to do so, and kind of off their own backs, essentially. So you're right, but it's just such a bigger problem, and I think it has to be addressed from the policy side.
What about this issue about temporary use? Because you could argue that, isn't that rather good? A building's going to be demolished, it's got 5 years of life, why not use it? Because actually, in a way, permanent solutions to just house homeless may even be worse than saying that it should recognise that this is not a sustainable way of dealing with homelessness, but we're going to be opportunistic if there's a space there to do it up.
No, I think why wouldn't you? And that comes back to the point I was talking about meanwhile uses, because homelessness, getting out of being homeless is a stepping stone process, and there isn't one solution. There's so many different groups. A family's needs is very, very different from a single person, and the space that they're in, first of all, is very heavily monitored, and that becomes less and less the case. So those spaces would never be permanent because your needs are changing. So yes, I think there's a role for all of these spaces, and the more the better.
I can see why you are bridling at the temporariness, but I think that it's maybe a more complex question. But shall we, anyone else? Oh, good, 2 hands up there. So you, Matt, first, yes, woman, and then Robert.
Hello. It's just because what you mentioned about policies, I think it's a really important point, and I think that it should be a dialogue open with the councils on how to improve this, because if a developer is given the option of, by providing some these type of houses, temporary houses for homeless, while they are through the planning process or decided how are they going to build it or where the money is coming from, if they get something in exchange, more people will be able to do it. And it's not the perfect option to just have temporary houses for homeless for 1 year or 2, but it will help, because I work in Gandham and it's awful what you see, and they kick them out, they close doors, and when a building gets empty, as soon as it's covered space, you see people sleeping underneath. But then those buildings that are empty for years, I think the council should be giving options or providing something in exchange for this.
Thank you.
So this is also a question for Heather. The premise of the competition that we ran here was to provide some kind of holistic sort of utopia, if you like. I mean, a mix of tenure and activity and need, from, I think, private to rental to temporary, affordable, and of course for the homeless. And I'm just wondering if, in the process of drawing up the competition rules, you looked at models elsewhere. For instance, has this worked as an idea in, say, San Francisco, which is sort of burdened terribly by homelessness? I just wondered if that's, there were active models that were a source of inspiration.
Okay, so starting with the councils, I've spoken to as many of the councils as would listen to me in this process, and there's a real range of views, but generally a willingness to help. So I think at the outset it was quite interesting, because all of them it comes down to what land they've got and what they can do, and every single council has a different type of land problem. And when we started writing the brief, we were trying to target, not stuff that's so small that it is relevant for kind of domestic users, but not stuff that's so big that it would be a fight against a developer for the difficult kind of in-between sites, which set the brief for the number of people. And Islington, for example, has a number of garages, so the model gets set around what that council has. And I think it was a range of ideas. Sorry, there was a range of opinions, but most councils are wanting to help and wanting to do stuff, but it comes back to the policy not enabling them to get the developers to work in that capacity. So I think they need ideas. I mean, they found it quite refreshing, I think, that we were coming forward, and the competition winners and everything were coming forward with alternate strategies, and they are a lot of them at the moment, particularly places like Enfield, they're having a massive drive on addressing homelessness, are trying to write stuff into their policy to make it more possible, but it does need help from policymakers and willingness from developers collectively for it to kind of come forward. Inspiration. So yeah, we looked at loads of different projects, and I think a reoccurring theme was the majority of them just dealt with shelter. So it was interesting because there's a lot of prefab models out there, and for that reason and the reason that I wanted to get a site and kind of take a project forward. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I'll just go back a
We're
step.
talking about just shelter rather than the holistic
Yeah,
point.
thank you. So the models were really interesting to show different ways of addressing shelter, but quite a lot of them were very scarily uninspiring in terms of what's the smallest area that we can get this accommodation in, and where can we fit it, and how is it going to cost the city the minimum so it's acceptable. And I think in reviewing them, the biggest aspiration I had was, no, it shouldn't just be about that. It should be about addressing policy and this bigger issue. So I think I learnt from them in terms of what are the issues you need to address, and there's various different user groups, and they each of them address different issues in the city well in different capacities, but none of them really looked at a holistic vision. So that was probably the most interesting thing. But
do you think that competition provided some visions for...
The entrance?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and including the economic models and the transitions and the kinds of people that were put together.
Yeah, so I think I was pleased because I really wanted people to understand the user group, and the majority of submissions had really kind of mapped the area, understood who the target audience was in terms of the homeless population, and really thought about how they would and could integrate with somebody else, but actually create a sustainable model. So,
and I think what was so great about the competition as well was that it wasn't just, as you were saying, about providing like shelter for the cheapest way possible, kind of compacted together. It was the calibre of architects that submitted just meant you got some really great architecture. There's really unique ways of thinking about the challenge, and so that meant it was it was quite visionary in many ways.
Yeah, and just really, there was like really clever things like people using prefab methodology to allow the people inhabiting that space to impact that space and actually have their own take on it, rather than, oh, you're lucky to have a bed, here it is. You know, it was more than that. And looking at, as you were saying previously, council models. So some of them were saying, well, you know, for example, well-being, gardening and gardening-based activities is really, really good for well-being. So how could you pair that so that you're getting the wellness factor as well as anything else? So working with local councils to address social housing initiatives to fix that garden, but as a way that they can get paid. And so the models were really, there was lots of clever ideas, and it was really interesting.
I was thinking about homelessness in Malawi and education in London for a minute, and I mean, it is interesting that when you know, there clearly is homelessness in some way or other in Malawi, but actually society is so organised that it doesn't throw up this kind of really horrible and disgusting and terrible scenario of, you know, people sleeping in doorways while millionaires walk by. You know, the discrepancy, and actually the acute, it lifts the problem into an area which is so highly political and way beyond, you know, simply architecture. So that's really fantastic that.
Because we're managing the balance.
Conversation,
we're managing the balance between kind of Heather working on these amazing projects, doing kind of these work with the homeless shelters and so on, but then also having developers who will want us to try and design things in a way which won't allow homeless people.
I have a suggestion to throw in on top of it. Yes, London and other UK cities have a lot of homelessness, but they also have a lot of people who find it hard to get a home because it's so expensive. And if you took a slightly larger view of that population, and many young people who come here who have no intention of being homeless, who want jobs, and maybe have jobs but no place to live, if you integrated that a little bit, these populations could really feed off each other, and you could get the people who are nearly homeless but before they are homeless, helping people who are homeless. So you could actually have quite an interactive population that then help each other to get jobs and start entrepreneurial enterprises. And it could be really interesting experiment if you just got one off the ground that could be a showcase for everybody else that then could develop policy. I don't think you can develop policy by sitting in a room and writing sentences. I think you need to show it.
Except maybe we should all pay some more tax and build some homes, and that would actually might be the real answer. I'm afraid we've got to wind up now. I'm being given hand signals from the distance. Or is there a hand up right at the back there? Yes, please. Let's make yours the question. Is there a microphone? Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Mine's more of a comment than a question, probably. Are you familiar with a charity called the House of St. Barnabas? They have a module that I thought was quite interesting for homelessness, because it's a beautiful building. It is quite an interesting space to be in. They have a restaurant, art gallery, and they also have a policy of, it's not a permanent solution, because when they have homeless people living with them, they train them, they give them not professional, but voluntary training, to get jobs, and they expect them to be moving on and not living there all the time. So did you see more proposals of that sort in while you were working and doing your research?
I think hold that thought, because I think it's more of a comment than so on. But you had a supplemental question. Could you pass the microphone forward? And this is your last chance. Does anybody else wants to ask a question? Okay, you're going to be the last person to ask a question. Let's go. I think it's all right.
I just want to make just to say that it's probably not only the accommodation, and it is that the facilities, and a lot of people who are either homeless or rough sleepers, especially the rough sleepers, they need facilities, and they come out with different problems that will be homeless. And there are problems of sleeplessness, there are problems, mental health problems. Yeah. And cities, towns, places need to accommodate for these kind of situations, if you like. And we need to actually embed solutions for the problems that are apparent within the design or planning of our urban spaces, our parks and squares and places, to accommodate a healthy environment for people who need to be outside, who need to live, to sleep out.
Thank you. And finally.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is more about, you were mentioning about making community, and I hear you all mention about the developers and the people who write the policies and the homeless, of course, or the students in the case of the school. But how do you deal with the other stakeholders? Because sometimes it's the people surrounding the areas where it's going to be developed who feels like their space is being occupied by people that maybe they don't trust completely in case of homeless, or in your case, the Malawi school was a success because the whole community uses. So how do you usually deal with those other stakeholders that are not that obvious?
Okay, thank you. Can we just have one sentence from everyone? You can pick up those answers.
One sentence.
2 sentences. All right, 2 sentences.
As an answer or as a summary?
Anything you want to say, you can pick up. You can riff on anything that you heard. You know, it's kind of free association time.
Well, I think our project in Malawi, in terms of engaging community and consultation, was actually, we learned so much with what we do in schools here, and it's the same thing that when you're building a new school in the UK as when you're building a new school in Malawi, it's making people feel like it's theirs, and they were part of the journey, and it was kind of their narrative project.
I think, to your question, I think it's about re-educating people. So it's not downplaying that process. It's a very difficult part of it. But actually, for example, New Horizon Youth Centre managed 24 hours a day. Those people are 16 to 25-year-olds. When people generally think about homelessness, they think about people at the end of the line. That's not the case, as hopefully the statistics showed today. So I think and people do want to help. So all of those things together, it's re-educating, I think. So.
Fantastic. B, any reflections?
Well, I really liked the two examples and the contrast between them, and how there is a lot of similarity of the gaining of ownership involving local people, and in this case, in the case of the homeless as well, the integration of people who are homeless with people who want to have a safe neighborhood and don't want their children attacked, and there are a lot of security issues that go with it. And I thought the comment that Sunan made about, homeless in Malawi and education in the UK, it bears reversing the topic and seeing how is that actually addressed, what actually does happen with education here. From my own experience, I would almost bet that there are far fewer homeless people in Malawi than there are here, because in Malawi, if you are homeless, you go to an urban slum and you pay 25p and you rent a room. And that's what people do. Every slum has landlords and has tenants, everywhere. And there's hierarchies of them.
And you know, not to glamorize it, but there's mutual support. So
there is support,
You find that very much in favelas, and you find it in Indian cities as well. But I think that the commonality between these projects and actually the work of Article 25 and of humanitarian architecture is that it comes at the any kind of social and other problems with design intelligence. And I heard recently of an architect who struggled for years with this homelessness problem. He wasn't homeless, but he became very passionate about trying to cure it. And then he hit on this idea that one of the biggest problems for homeless people is no fixed abode, no address. So, and actually, if you don't have an address, you are denied all kinds of benefits from the society. I don't mean benefits in the sense of, you know, housing benefit and so on, but actually simply access to medical care and all sorts of things. He set up this really clever method.
The post office box.
Post office box.
He's part of the working group.
And so he's part of your working group. Well, it's such a beautiful idea that everybody can have an address, even if it is, in effect, a kind of proxy address. And there may even be somebody else living there, but, you know.
It's a step towards something. And it's that thing the dichotomy we were talking about as well, about is it that step process, or is it that, because right now the process in the UK is that you have to step change from different steps in the assisted living system to get to a home. Yeah. But in other countries they're looking at a completely opposite way, and you get a home first, and that's when.
Well, Brazil, for example, until Bolsonaro just axed it, had a massive program of just simply building houses, saying we'll get rid of this homelessness problem and giving people homes paid for through the exchequer. Anyway, let this project and this kind of discussion continue, and thank you all for attending and asking such great questions. Thank you for John McAslan Partners for hosting us, Robert, for you comparing it, and of course, above all, to our speakers. Let's give them a big hand and we'll do that.